You see, it's strange because at one period when they're asking me, I was saying, no, never, what the hell, go back, no, not me. And then there came to a period when I thought, well, why not? If we felt like making a record or doing something, everybody always envisages the stage show. To me, if we worked together at studio again, you know.
There's a photograph from September 2010 that stopped a lot of Beatles fans in their tracks. In it, 5 people are standing together, smiling, some of them with their arms around each other. One of them is Yoko Ono. Another is Cynthia Lennon. Another is May Pang. And in the middle of it all is Julian Lennon, John Lennon's first son, hosting the opening night of his own photography exhibition. For decades, these people have been kept apart by grief, money, and old wounds. That night, they weren't. So how did a family that had spent 30 years suing each other, avoiding each other, and quietly resenting each other end up in the same room, laughing? That's the story we're telling today. Not a story of hatred, but of a much messier, much more human thing. A son trying to figure out how to feel about the people who shaped his childhood by mostly not being there. Julian Charles John Lennon was born on the 8th of April, 1963, in Liverpool, to John Lennon and his first wife, Cynthia Powell. The two of them had met a few years earlier at art college, and their relationship had already survived plenty of turbulence before Julian arrived, including a marriage that was kept secret from the public for a while because the Beatles' management worried that a married John Lennon would be bad for business. Julian was named after his grandmother, Julia, John's mother, who had died when John was still a teenager. From a very start. Then, Julian's name carried weight, a tribute to a woman his father had lost too soon, wrapped around a child who spent his own life trying to get close to a father who kept slipping away. For the first few years of his life, Julian had something close to a normal childhood, at least by Beatles standards. He has said that as a small boy he assumed his family was happy, that his dad had a place in the world and a family who loved him, and that nothing seemed wrong. But behind that ordinary front, things were already fraying. John was becoming one of the most famous men on the planet, and fame, as it turned out, was not kind to his marriage. He struggled with jealousy, with mood swings, and, by his own much later admission, with moments of real anger toward the women in his life. He was also beginning to experiment with LSD, a period Cynthia would later describe as the moment she felt him drifting into a world she couldn't follow him into. Then, in 1966, John met a Japanese-American avant-garde artist named Yoko Ono at a gallery opening in London. Nothing happened right away. But over the next 2 years, Yoko became a bigger and bigger presence in John's life, showing up at the house, calling constantly, talking with him about art and ideas, a way that Cynthia, by her own account, felt shut out of. In May of 1968, while Cynthia was away on holiday, John invited Yoko over. They spent the night together working on music, and by the time Cynthia came home, she found Yoko in her house, wearing her bathrobe, drinking tea, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That moment effectively ended the marriage. Julian was 5 years old. What followed was messy and, frankly, cruel by any modern standard. There were accusations flying in both directions, a rumored affair on Cynthia's side that was used as leverage, and eventually a divorce settlement that gave Cynthia custody of Julian along with a relatively modest payment. John, for his part, moved on quickly and publicly with Yoko, and within about a year of the divorce, the two of them were married. From that point on, Julian's relationship with his father became something closer to occasional visits than daily life. He has said that roughly a decade went by during which he and his father barely spoke. It's worth pausing here on one thing that often gets skipped over. The people around Julian noticed what was happening to him, even if his father seemed slow to. Paul McCartney, in particular, made a habit of driving out to check on Cynthia and Julian after the split. On one of those visits, inspired by wanting to comfort a 5-year-old boy watching his parents' marriage collapse, McCartney started writing a song called Hey Jules. He eventually changed it to Hey Jude, because he thought it sang better, but the sentiment behind it never really changed. It was written for a child who needed someone in his corner. Decades later, Julian has spoken about having complicated feelings toward that song. He's heard it more times than almost anyone else alive, and while he appreciates what it represents, he's also said that being reminded of it constantly, friends sending him videos of kids singing it, for instance, can bring back a period of his life he doesn't necessarily want to relive on command. Julian stayed with his mother through his childhood, moving from a school near Hoylake in England to a boarding school in North Wales after Cynthia remarried. Away from the spotlight his father lived in, Julian found his own outlets: drawing, painting, and increasingly music. His father was entirely absent during these years. There were sporadic visits, some of them encouraged by John's girlfriend at the time, May Pang, during the mid-1970s period he later referred to as his lost weekend. On one of those visits, John bought Julian a Gibson Les Paul guitar and a drum machine and taught him a few chords. It wasn't much in terms of hours spent together, but for a kid starved of his father's attention, it left a real mark. One of the strangest, most quietly moving details from this era involved a song most people know by heart without ever knowing its origin. When Julian was a young boy, he brought home a watercolor painting he'd made of a school friend named Lucy O'Donnell, surrounded by stars. His father loved it so much that it became the seed for Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So even during the years Julian felt distant from his father, some small part of him was already woven into the music that would define John's legacy. Julian would return to that connection decades later, releasing his own tribute song called Lucy in 2009, and donating half the proceeds to lupus research, since O'Donnell had died of complications related to the disease. Julian's own career in music started almost by accident. At 11 years old, he played drums on a track called Yeah for his father's album Walls and Bridges, credited in the liner notes as starring on drums. A decade later, in 1984, he released his debut solo album, The Lot, which became an unexpected commercial success, spawning the hit Too Late for Goodbyes and earning him a Grammy nomination for Best New Artist. The comparisons to his father started immediately, and they never really stopped. Some critics praised the songwriting on its own terms. Plenty of others couldn't get past the fact that his voice, at certain angles, sounded eerily like John's. It was a strange position to be in, talented enough to have a real career, but never quite able to separate that career from the shadow of a man he barely knew. Through the 80s and 90s, Julian kept releasing music, with mixed commercial results, while also drifting toward causes outside the industry: environmental work, philanthropy, and eventually photography. He turned down chances to be publicly associated with the Beatles' reunion, and when journalists asked Paul McCartney directly why Julian wasn't invited to participate in the 1990s Beatles anthology project, McCartney's answer was blunt: nobody wanted to put him through that. It's a small moment, but it says a lot about how the surviving Beatles saw Julian's position, not as an outsider to be excluded out of spite, but as someone who'd already been through enough without being pulled deeper into his father's legend. Now here's where the story gets to the part most people actually came for: what Julian has said, in his own words, about his father and about Yoko Ono. Julian has never pretended his relationship with John was simple or warm. He's spoken about hearing secondhand reports of unkind things his father reportedly said about him, including comparison, relayed to him years later, contrasting him unfavorably with his younger half-brother Sean. Whether every detail of every account like that is airtight is hard to verify decades on, but Julian has said the sting of hearing it stayed with him. He's also been openly critical of the gap between his father's public image and his private behavior, telling one interviewer that a man who preached peace and love to the entire world struggled to actually show that love to the people closest to him, his first wife and his first son. That's not a small accusation to make about someone, let alone a parent. And Julian has acknowledged it wasn't easy to say out loud. At the same time, Julian's relationship with his father's memory isn't frozen in resentment. Watching later documentaries and archival footage, including the Get Back project years afterward, Julian has talked about rediscovering a version of his dad he remembered fondly from childhood. Playful, funny, sarcastic. The guy he says he fell in love with again before things fell apart. That's an important detail, because it shows Julian's feelings toward his father were never one note. He could hold real anger about being sidelined and real tenderness for the man underneath the fame at the same time. In a 2020 interview, he said he strives for forgiveness and understanding around the hard years his mother and he went through, while also noting that things between him and his father had genuinely started improving before John was murdered in December 1980, outside his apartment building in New York, by a man who had been stalking him. That murder didn't just take John Lennon's life. It also froze whatever reconciliation might have happened between him and Julian, whatever the two of them were rebuilding. It stopped permanently on that night, And Julian has said that loss carries a particular kind of regret, not just grief for a father, but grief for a relationship that was interrupted before it had the chance to fully heal. Then there's Yoko. It's tempting and honestly lazy to frame Julian's relationship with Yoko Ono as simple hatred. The truth is more complicated and arguably more interesting. For years after John's death, Julian and Yoko were locked in a genuinely bitter legal fight. John's, who had left the bulk of his estate, reported to be worth well over $100 million to Yoko, with nothing directly designated for Julian. Julian pursued legal action, and after roughly 16 years of disputes, the two sides reached a settlement, reportedly in the range of $20 million, sometime in the mid-1990s. Even after that settlement, tension lingered. Julian has spoken about having personally buy back letters and postcards he'd written to his father, and letters his father had sent him, because Yoko wouldn't simply hand them over. That's a real, documented grievance, and it's not something Julian has ever pretended didn't happen, but it's also not the whole picture. Over time, largely because of his bond with his half-brother Sean, Julian made a deliberate choice to stop carrying that fight forward. He's explained it in fairly plain terms. Hurting Sean's mother means hurting Sean, and because he loves Sean, he decided the stress of an ongoing feud with Yoko simply wasn't worth it anymore. That's not the language of someone who despises a person. It's the language of someone choosing peace not because the old hurt disappeared, but because a newer, more important relationship mattered more to him than staying angry. That choice showed up publicly at the 2010 photography exhibition we opened with. For the first time, all 5 people most connected to John Lennon's life, Cynthia, May, Yoko, Sean, and Julian, were in the same room, and instead of tension, witnesses described laughter and even embraces. Julian told reporters that night that photography had become his own space, something his father never did, which let him breathe a little outside John's shadow. It wasn't a full resolution of decades of hurt, but it was proof that hurt and connection could coexist in the same family at the same party, without either one canceling the other out. In more recent years, Sean Lennon has publicly pushed back on the idea that he and Julian are anything but close, describing regular video calls and describing their bond as being like close friends as much as brothers. And Julian's own comment about Yoko has settled into something more resigned than hostile, an acknowledgement that the past happened, that it hurt, and that dragging it forward indefinitely wasn't a price he was willing to keep paying. So where does that leave the idea that Julian Lennon despises anyone? Honestly, it doesn't hold up. What actually comes through across decades of interviews isn't despair or hatred. It's exhaustion with a particular kind of pain and a slow, imperfect, very human process of deciding what to do with it. Julian lost meaningful time with his father to fame, to a marriage that collapsed publicly, and finally to a murder that cut off any chance of full repair. He lost years to a legal battle with his stepmother over money and belongings that should never have needed lawyers in the first place. And through all of it, he built his own career, his own identity, and eventually his own version of peace, built less around forgetting the past and more around refusing to let it keep costing him relationships he still had left, especially with his brother. That's arguably a more compelling story than a simple grudge anyway. It's the story of someone famous largely by accident of birth, who spent his life trying to become something more than a footnote in someone else's legend, while quietly working out how much of his family's pain he was willing to keep carrying. If there's a lesson in Julian Lennon's story, it might be this. Forgiveness doesn't always look like a dramatic reconciliation scene. Sometimes it just looks like showing up to a party, standing in the same room as the people who hurt you, and choosing, for the sake of someone you love, not to bring the fight with you. What do you think shaped Julian Lennon's path more, his father's absence or his stepmother's presence? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the families behind music's biggest legends, make sure you're subscribed.